Hello, hello. Happy Mondays, everyone. Happy Mondays. My name is Nick Dagan Best, and welcome to my astrology live stream. I hope you folks are all doing well. I'm presuming a lot of you tuned in yesterday when Patrick and I went through our Mercury retrograde transits through the 12 houses. Of course, we only got about as far as house 6, so we're going to pick that up where we left off last week. I wasn't sure what I'd talk about today, as per usual, but I did have one thought. I think it was a Purba suggested a couple of weeks ago that I talk about the famous Club of 27, all the famous rock stars who died at the age of 27, and that I look at their charts and their excuse me. I look at their charts and their annual perfections and the transits and all that, and talk about their departures, their early departures from planet Earth, and how there's this literal sort of, well, not literal, but this club of 27 that everyone is named. Hey there, everyone. Hi, Kai. Hi, Stephanie. Hi, everyone else joining us. So, yeah, I don't know. Hopefully, people are down with that. I know, first of all, obviously, death is a touchy subject for anybody. It's a touchy subject in astrology because certainly one does not go around saying, aha, I see in your chart you're going to die 3 days from now or something like that. Can be very damaging, regardless of whether it's done properly or not. Okay, there's a Purba. All right. Yes. All right. She's excited. All right. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about rock stars and their deaths and what their charts were like and why did they leave us at 27. The four main ones I'm going to look at are the most obvious ones. I don't have a birth time for Brian Jones, so I can't cover him. I can get into Amy Winehouse later. I have a file on her, but I don't know nearly as much about her life as I do about these other four. These other four being Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and Kurt Cobain. So without further ado, I thought I would just sort of take us through these and, yeah, there's some other people I'm going to mention along the way, but away we go. Okay, so let's see, who shall we start with? Jim Morrison, sure. So this is my Doors file. There's 652 charts in here. The Doors are one of these rare bands where we've got birth times for all four members of the band. Ages ago, I did these sort of rectifications on them, but I wouldn't swear by them. I literally did them over 20 years ago, but I still keep them in the file. So, yeah, everyone from like Paul Rothschild, who produced their first 5 albums, William Blake and Aldous Huxley, both authors who famously influenced Jim Morrison, influenced the name of the band. Band members Ray Manzarek, Jim Morrison, obviously, John Densmore, and Robbie Krieger. Robbie Krieger has a twin brother named Ronald Krieger. So we have both their birth times, and just other people in their, orbit. Patricia Keneally, who was sort of supposedly legally married to Jim Morrison at one point in some kind of esoteric ceremony. But then there's Pamela Courson, who was more, his live-in girlfriend and who was with him when he died and all that. So, yeah, a lot of different people. And then I go into the transits and here's the day John Densmore joins the Doors. The day Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek meet up at Venice Beach, July 8th, 1965, and decide they're going to start a band together. I think the earliest chart I have is Jim was arrested when he was 19 at a football stadium in Tallahassee. So there's a rep sheet on him for that. So I've got that transit. I've got him and Ray Manzarek meeting up at Venice Beach. And then, they get John Dunsmore in the band. They do a demo, which I've heard, a 6-song demo with Ray Manzarek's brothers. And then the brothers all quit and Robbie Krieger joins the band later in 65. And then through 66, they're playing a bunch of gigs, the London Fog, which are sort of notorious gigs, and then the famous Whiskey A Go Go, which they start in May. And they're performing there right up until August, when Jim Morrison famously, in the middle of the end, premieres his Oedipus chorus in the end. For those of you who know, you know. Anyway, they get fired that night, but they also get a record contract. They sign a record contract with the Doors in '66. A few months later, the first album is released. It's recorded in, I believe, early September of '66 after they signed the contract. And from there, we get, like My Fire is going to be a big hit all through '67. The famous photo of Jim Morrison, the young lion, where he's shirtless with a string of beads. That's taken on September 18th, 1967, during this Venus retrograde with Jupiter here. So we go on. Strange Days comes out. He gets arrested just after his birthday in New Haven. That's a chart we might look at some point. The transits for that are very interesting. This is his 24th birthday, so it's, of course, a Venus and Jupiter joint synodic return. From there, we go into 1968. There's an American tour that's quite long, and then they release this is the month of month, and they play some really explosive gigs, and then they go to Europe. Some of you might have seen footage of them playing Europe in September of '68. This Amsterdam gig has really good footage. The London gigs have good footage. I think the Sweden gig has good footage of that tour. And then from there, they work on the Soft Parade album. And then in March of 1969, Jim Morrison exposes himself to his concert audience, and there's going to be a court trial. He's going to be charged with obscenity, lewd obscenity, or lewd behavior, or something like that. Lewd behavior, I believe, and will be facing prison time even still when at the time of his death 2 years from now. So yeah, Miami sort of derails the Doors. You can see they have a bunch of gigs canceled, and they try to sort of move on. There's some shows in Mexico City. Some of their live album was recorded at those shows, as were these ones at the Aquarius Theater in Hollywood. And then they record. So here's Jim pleading not guilty in November of '69. This is an ongoing court case, but on his way back from the Miami trial, he also gets arrested for being drunk and disorderly on a plane. I think it was going from Miami back to LA, and they landed in Phoenix, or maybe he was headed to Phoenix. But anyway, he gets arrested yet again. He's getting himself into all kinds of trouble. This is when the Doors are releasing Morrison Hotel. This is the show my mother saw in Montreal when the one time the Doors played Montreal. And then this is the last year of Jim's life in 1970. So the show's at the Felt Forum. Some of you might have heard those live recordings that were released. Really, really good. This is sort of like the highlight of the Doors live stuff. This Pittsburgh show, there's a live album of that. The Boston show, which I think is in April. Yeah, there's Boston. There's a live album of that. Vancouver as well. This one in Vancouver, I think Albert King joins them on that. And that takes you into the summer of 1970. They play the Isle of Wight Festival. There's a very good video of that performance, and that's one of their very last ones. And then shortly after, that's the Isle of Wight. Jimi Hendrix also performs at the Isle of Wight, and it's shortly after that that Jimi Hendrix dies. And then shortly after that Janis Joplin dies. Someone else who died very recently was Al Wilson of the band Canned Heat, who was actually a closer friend of Jim's than, like, Jim knew Jimmy and Janis. He'd met them here and there, but Al Wilson of Canned Heat was an actual friend of his, and he died of probably suicide just 2 weeks before Jimmy. So there was this string of deaths, and the Doors recorded LA Woman towards the end of the year going into 1971. He also recorded his a poetry session on his last birthday, the day he turned 27. 27 is a fourth house perfection year. We'll look at Jim's chart in a minute, but he recorded for those of you who know his poetry readings, that was recorded that day. So they recorded LA Woman during this period, and then Jim arrived in Paris, in March of '71. LA Woman was released in April while he was already in Paris. And then his last days at Paris, it's known that he ate at this restaurant, La Coupole, on June 27th, 1971, and then he was found dead July 3rd, 71, and buried on July 7th. And everything that follows there is not, well, not relevant to his life. There's things relating to his legacy that I have in the database. So let's look at his chart. Whoops. Give him some angles here. All right, so this is Jim Morrison's chart. You can see he's a Aquarius rising. I'm going to touch on this in a minute. And when he died, he was 27, which is a fourth house perfection year. And you see that that's the sign of his moon. If we do the solar return, the year he died, we'll relocate it. Well, he wasn't in Paris for his birthday. Maybe I don't need, it's not really going to matter. I'm not going to angles for a solar return. But anyway, here we are. This is his solar return. And he's in a fourth house perfection year. Saturn happens to be in the fourth house. The Lord of the year is Venus, and it happens to have Mars sitting right on top of his natal Venus. And this Mars is especially important because when you get to Jim's death chart, when he dies, he is found dead on July 3rd, 1971. And what's happening here is this Mars in Aquarius, you can see the nodes are right on his ankles, but this Mars in Aquarius is just about to station retrograde in his first house. This is striking to me, this Mars retrogrades in Aquarius, a lot of you have probably heard me say in the past, they're incredibly rare. Prior to 1971, there had been a Mars retrograde in early Aquarius in 1939 that wandered back into Capricorn. And then after 1971, we wouldn't have another Mars retrograde in Aquarius until the year 2018. So they're really infrequent, but this Jim happens to be in Aquarius rising, and he happens to die right as Mars is stationing retrograde in his first house. Of course, he was born with natal Mars retrograde, actually quite a bright Mars, because you can see he was born within just a few days of the exact opposition of the Sun and Mars. So his Mars would have been burning very bright. You see that in 1943. Those 1943 Sagittarians are particular sort of rebels. You get your Keith Richards, your Jim Morrison. What was the name of the guy who started Studio 54? He was also one of them, 1943 Sagittarians, with this very bright Mars next to Uranus. Also, the perfected Lord of the Year is Venus, and that happens to be on Jim's Saturn. So, yeah, Jim tempted fate a lot, but he finally kind of ran out of luck, I think. Let me see before I. Okay. All right. So those are my initial observations of Jim Morrison. Let's look at the next one. My next one, I'll look at the other Aquarius rising of the foursome I'm going to talk about today. And that is Janis Joplin. This is Janis's chart, so you can see she's also Aquarius rising. But she's not going to live long enough to see Mars go retrograde in her first house. She'll never live to see Mars go retrograde in her first house. Because Jim died July 3rd, 1971, and Janis is going to die on October 4th, 1970. Jim is the last of that 60s bunch to die. So that's Janis's death chart. And Yeah, let me take you through her file first. It's not quite as big as the Doors one, but of course her career is really different. She had 3 different bands in that brief period that she was, a star, and, yeah, I mean, I have some of the musicians in her life and, Chris Christopherson, who, wrote Me and Bobby McGee, and Paul Rothschild, who was also in the Doors file, because Paul Rothschild produced both, Janis's and the Doors records. And then I have the guys in Big Brother and the Holding Company, but I've been meaning to add musicians from her other groups like Full Tilt Boogie and Cosmic Blues Band. So yeah, Janis's chart. I've got her performing live for the first time in 1961 when she's still a folk singer. Um, Hitchhiking to San Francisco in early 1963. Recording this sort of blues recording with Jorma Kaukonen from who will be in Jefferson Airplane someday. This is 1964, so Janis and Jorma are still nobodies, young nobodies, but they record this tape that now gets it's a very well known bootleg, gets passed around. June of '66, Janis joins Big Brother and the Holding Company, and they perform a week later their live debut at the Avalon Ballroom. And then there's, a bunch of gigs, recording sessions for the first Big Brother album. Her famous appearance at the Monterey Pop Festival on June 17th, '67. Those transits there. Um, Going into '68, this is her famous recording of Ball and Chain at the Winterland and Piece of My Heart and Summertime. Those recordings that are some of her best known are done in April and May of '68. She appears on stage with Johnny Cash, or no, sorry, she's in the crowd for a Johnny Cash show. I think later she's on his TV show. This is when she just attends a Johnny Cash concert. She switches bands to the Cosmic Blues Band. Here she is performing in Memphis in Christmas of 1968. She appears with the Cosmic Blues Band on Ed Sullivan in March of '69 during the Venus retrograde. Just going into it, and Mars is about to go retrograde too. She plays in Woodstock. Everyone knows Woodstock. The Doors did not appear at Woodstock, but Janis and Jimmy are at Woodstock. She's arrested for swearing at a policeman in Tampa, Florida. That happens. She plays a reunion show with the Big Brother and the Holding Company in April of 1970, and then she does a bunch of gigs with the Full Tilt Boogie Band, including a train tour through Canada, these gigs in Toronto and Calgary. There's a great movie called Festival Express, and you can see clips of her performances. She's really at the top of her game. And then, yeah, she goes to her high school reunion in August of 1970, and she wraps up work on the Pearl album in September of 1970, and dies just before it can be completed on October 4th, 1970. So that's the timeline I have on Janis. It does have less detail than the Doors one, I think. I think the Jimmy one might have more detail than the Doors one. I forget. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. All right, so this is Janis's chart on the inside and her death chart on the outside. So since she's also Aquarius rising, she's also in a 4th house perfection year because she's also 27 years old. She was 11 months older than Jim Morrison. He was born in December 43. She's born in January 43. As you'll see, Jimi Hendrix is born in November of 42. So he was only about 6 weeks older than Janis, 6-7 weeks older than Janis. And they only die a couple of weeks apart. And then Jim dies like 10 months after them. Anyway, so Janis is also in a Taurus year. She's also got Saturn in Taurus, just like Jim did when he was in a Taurus perfection year. So right away, Saturn's in the perfected sign of the year. And it was exactly opposite the Lord of the year, Venus, which of course rules Taurus. And this Venus is actually slowing down to go retrograde. Both Jimmy and Janis died as Venus was slowing down to retrograde in Scorpio. It's a red 2. They both died during the red 2 interval. And really, it's quite, Saturn, of course, is also the ruler of her chart, the same thing as it was for Jim Morrison. Um, so yeah, you can see sort of, while you never can specifically predict death, you can see how those fourth house perfection years, how they, it became this sort of pattern with these rock musicians. All right. Let's do Jimmy, and then we'll do Jimmy, and then we'll go to Kurt. And this way, we're doing the '60s people first, and then the second half is the Seattle guys. The left-handed Seattle guitar players who fronted hard rock trios, who have Moon and Jupiter in Cancer. Yeah, so this is Jimmy. Like I said, he's got the Moon and Jupiter in Cancer, just like Kurt Cobain, who we'll get to in a bit. So Jimmy is a Sagittarius rising. So this Jupiter of his in the eighth house is the chart ruler. And since he died also at the age of 27, Pisces was the perfected sign. Jupiter, therefore, was also the Lord of the year when Jimmy died. So I'll take you through my Jimmy file. So Jimmy's file has 347 charts. How many did the Doors have? 652. Okay, so the Doors is a much bigger file. I think there's just maybe more live detail. Although I've done my best to have a detailed file on Jimmy. If anything, he's my top favorite out of all of these musicians, although I love them all. So Jimmy's file, here's his chart. I've shown it to you. I've got his father, his mother, musicians he played with, like Little Richard and the Isley Brothers, Chas Chandler, who would be his manager, Billy Cox, the bass player, who was a friend of his going back to his time in the military, Juma Sultan, who's a percussionist who just played with him at Woodstock, Larry Lee, another old friend of his who only played with him at Woodstock, a girlfriend named Monica Danneman, and who she's the woman who's with him when he dies, and there's some very sort of, yeah, she's kind of a sketchy figure for that reason. Yeah, she might have. Anyway, it's kind of a long story. I won't get into all of that, but she is with him when he dies. Noel Redding, the bass player, who may have been born at we know he was born at 6:30, but we don't know if it was AM or PM. So I keep an AM and a PM chart for Noel Redding. And then other musicians, Buddy Miles, who played drums in the band of Gypsies. Some of Jimmy's siblings, Leon, Kathy Ira. The date of his parents' divorce. Elvis Presley played Seattle in 1957, and Jimmy was at this concert. This is sort of, there's a parallel incident when I get to Nirvana, when Nirvana see Black Flag. Both of these incidents occurred just as Pluto's ingressed into a new sign. So the very month that Pluto ingresses into Virgo, Jimmy sees Elvis Presley. And this impacts him. He wants to be Elvis, like any young guy who sees Elvis live. And yeah, Pluto's just entered Virgo. Like sort of the Pluto and Virgo is a real signature of the '60s, even though this is still 1957. It's sort of like everything's shaping up, if you know what I mean. The guy who is going to be one of the most important musicians of the '60s is getting his is having his eureka moment. He's inspired by seeing Elvis. But shortly after that, his mother dies. His mother was troubled. She had been a teenage mom. There was a lot of strife in his family, which he would write about in his music. So then Jimmy enlists in the U.S. Army Reserve, and this is his failed marksman test. There were records on the Smoking Gun website of his old military records. So there were some interesting, he failed the marksman test on June 30th, 1961. Then he joined the Airborne at the end of October of 1961. And he was eventually discharged. He was caught. He was caught pleasuring himself while he was supposed to be mopping the bathroom or something like that. And there's a whole report on that. It's even got a time to it. So that's a chart for that. And then he was discharged from the 101st Airborne on July 2nd, 1962. And from here, he embarked as a professional musician. Like I said, he met Billy Cox while he was in the Airborne, and I think he also met Larry Lee there, and they played together in bands. First, close to the base, which I believe at this point, yeah, was Fort Campbell, Kentucky. So I think he was playing around Kentucky and Tennessee, and eventually became a touring musician, touring with Don Covey. Um, I found some like old postcards he wrote to his father. So these are postcards, the dates of postcards he wrote to his father. I know he appeared with Little Richard at the Paramount Theater in New York City, April of 1965. So he's still working as a backup musician for people like Little Richard. More postcards. He recorded with the Isley Brothers in August of 65, and then he recorded with Curtis Knight in October of 65. Performed with the Isley Brothers again. This is in the middle of October 65. He signs a record contract that's really bad. That'll come back to haunt him when he does eventually become famous. That'll really mess up his life quite a bit. And so, yeah, other gigs: Ray Sharp, King Curtis, Curtis Knight, Ray Sharp, et cetera, until finally in July of 1966, when Jimmy's leading his own band at the Cafe Wha in New York. He meets Chas Chandler, who's the bass player in the Animals, who wants to move into music management. And Chas Chandler offers Jimmy the opportunity to come back to England and become a recording artist under Chas Chandler's management. So that's in July of 66. In September of 66, Jimmy and Chas leave New York and they fly to London. This always blows me away. This is September 23rd, 1966, the day Jimmy lands in London. He is 4 years minus 5 days from dying in London. But in those 4 years minus 5 days, everything we know about him as an icon, as a recording artist, every note of music we know of his, every song he wrote, all those things, all of that was written and produced during these 4 years between September 23rd, 1966, when he leaves New York for London, and September 18th, 1970, when he leaves us. So he lands in London. He meets Noel Redding at an audition about a week later. He meets Cream. He jams with them, actually, and blows Eric Clapton's mind. Eric Clapton goes and gets a perm so he can be more like Jimmy. And then Mitch Mitchell joins the trio. And so now you have the Jimi Hendrix Experience. You have the drummer, Mitch Mitchell, and the bass player, Noel Redding. And so he starts rehearsing with his band in October. He plays his first gig on October 13th. And he plays in France. And he also starts recording songs. He's recording Hey Joe, Stone Free, Foxy Lady, and so on and so forth. And he's recording the songs for his first album. And you move into 1967. February 20th, 1967, the day that Kurt Cobain is born, Jimmy's recording his song, I Don't Live Today. You can see he had just done some Fire and The Wind Cries Mary not long before. He's going to do Manic Depression a few days later. Are You Experienced in April? So on and so forth. So he records and he gigs. When Sgt. Pepper comes out on June 4th, he performs at the Saville Theater in front of all the Beatles, and he opens up with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a song that only just came out a couple of days earlier, and he's performing it live in front of the Beatles. And then later that month, he performs at the Monterey Pop Festival, just like Janis did. There's a famous movie of this. And that's the show that really makes him a rock star, like a sensation back in the States. So more recording sessions. His album is finally released in the States. He's recording songs for his second album. He's performing gigs in Europe. More recording. He performs at the Albert Hall, where he'll perform again. Finally, Axis Bold as Love comes out, but then he's already starting to record songs for his next album, like Crosstown Traffic. He's arrested for getting drunk and damaging his hotel room in Sweden. He records All Along the Watchtower in January of 68. And then when we get to April, May of 68, you can see he's recording a lot of other songs for his Electric Ladyland album, like House Burning Down and Voodoo Child. so on and so forth. So yeah, more gigs, more gigs. Yeah, August of '68. I think Jimmy and was it the Doors or the Who? They all play in New York, very close together around the same time. More gigs throughout 1968, and the experience is starting to get really sort of burned out. Electric Ladyland comes out towards the end of '68. Jimmy performs at the Royal Albert Hall again in February of '69. There's a great movie of that. And then more demos and touring the States in the spring of '69 until finally Jimmy is arrested in Toronto for carrying heroin in May of '39 after a gig in Detroit before a gig in Toronto. And so now he's going to have legal problems over that. There's a court hearing on June 19th. Meanwhile, he's playing shows in like Honolulu, Seattle. He goes back and stays with his family in Seattle. And then finally in Denver on June 29th, he plays his last gig with the Jimi Hendrix Experience with the original lineup. From there, he puts together a new band, and he performs at Woodstock. There's Woodstock. He performs in Harlem, and he works out his contract problem, and he's going to record with the Band of Gypsies, his new band, at Fillmore East on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. And there's great live recordings of this stuff that you've probably heard, like the track Machine Gun is recorded at these. Right. And then from there, the management want Jimmy to go back with the old members of the Experience. Jimmy wants to stay with his current band, and then he comes to a compromise. He keeps Billy Cox from the Band of Gypsies, and he keeps Mitch Mitchell from the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and he's got sort of the perfect band in a way. And that's the band he has for the rest of his life, for the next 9 months. Going through 1970, there's a lot of really great gigs that he performs, many of which are on live albums and movies. Berkeley, Jimmy live at Berkeley in May of 1970 is a famous one. There's also a video of him at the Atlanta Pop Festival here July 4th. There's also his gig in Maui in July of 1970. There's a good footage of that, film footage of that. And then he performs at the Isle of Wight Festival. I'm showing you the Doors were here as well. So it's August 31st, 1970. And he has only just opened his new recording studio, Electric Lady. And he goes to Europe. He performs at Isle of Wight. He plays a bunch of other gigs for about 2 weeks. This last one in Fehmarn, Germany, goes really badly, and the tour is sort of abruptly canceled. And this is September 6th. And he wanders back to London, and he kind of hangs around London until September 18th, which is 2 weeks after his last gig. And that's when he dies. Ostensibly choking on his vomit, but frankly, the circumstances of his death are very mysterious. All right, so let's look at his death. So Jimmy, like I said, is Sagittarius rising. Therefore, he's in a fourth house perfection year, which is Pisces, ruled by Jupiter. Transiting Jupiter is the Lord of the year is in the 12th with Venus, the house he's got Mars in. And meanwhile, everything is opposite the perfected sign. Excuse me. So the North Node's in Pisces in the perfected sign, but everything from Mars, Mercury retrograde, Sun, and Pluto. And the thing about perfections is that the axis always counts. Like even if you're in a fourth house perfection year, the stuff happening up here is going to be really, really important. Yeah, I mean the thing about Jimmy's death, there's a lot of conspiracy, for instance, around Kurt Cobain's death, as people may know, but which I've never found all that credible. But Jimmy's death doesn't have that much controversy around it, and yet I find it a lot more sort of suspicious. I won't go into the details, but I think it's a lot more likely that something ran afoul with Jimmy than it did with Kurt. Okay, I'm just going to quickly check the comments here, see how I'm coming along. Yeah, Bliss to Be, I went through everything quite detailed, so I'm not gonna do it a second time. You'll have to catch up with the video, I think. Um, yeah, Kai says that the 4th is the end of things, death and burials, and I would agree with that. Um, okay. Okay. Um, so we're gonna move on to Kurt Cobain. Um, remember, Jimmy's got the moon Jupiter in Cancer, and he's a left-handed guitar player from a Seattle-based rock trio. Well, I guess his band wasn't Seattle-based, but he was from Seattle. And Kurt wasn't technically from Seattle, but he's from Washington State, and he's thought of as a Seattle musician. That was always kind of controversial in itself. All right, so this is Kurt's chart. Kurt was a Virgo rising. You can see he's got the moon and Jupiter in his 11th house, whereas Jimmy has had his moon Jupiter in Cancer in the 8th house. But yeah, Kurt's a Virgo rising, and so when he died at the age of 27, he was in a Sagittarius perfection year, but that still brings up that Jupiter in Cancer, and that seems to be a culprit here. First, let me take you through the Nirvana file. 351 charts, so about almost the same number as I have Jimmy charts in my Jimmy file, but not as big as my Doors file. Okay, so yeah, I have people like David Geffen and Butch Vig, who was their record producer, Pat Smear, who would eventually become their second guitar player, Jonathan Poneman of Sub Pop Records, Steve Albini, whose birth time I got years ago through a friend who was recording with him. Yeah, for those of you who've never seen Steve Albini's chart, there you are. He produced Nirvana's In Utero album. We have Courtney Love, of course, Kurt Cobain's wife. Mark Lanigan, the singer from the Screaming Trees, who was a friend of Kurt's. They recorded a record together. Chris Novoselic, the bass player from Nirvana. Melora Krager, who is a cellist and who she performs with her own band called Rasputina, who are really awesome. But she performed with Nirvana on their last tour. She's on the Unplugged record, for instance. Chad Channing, the first drummer in Nirvana before Dave Grohl. Well, he's not the first, but the previous drummer before Dave Grohl. I think there were a bunch before him. So I've got Kurt's chart. Jason Everman, who was briefly the guitarist in Nirvana. He toured with them. And then later he was a bass player in Soundgarden. And then he went on to join the military. There's some very interesting interviews with this dude. He served in the military in Afghanistan. He's kind of an interesting figure. Anyway, that's Jason Everman. Dan Peters, drummer from the great Mudhoney, who briefly was a drummer for Nirvana between Chad Channing and Dave Grohl. He plays on the song. I think he's on Dive. He's on either Dive or Sliver. He's on one of those two songs. I think it's Dive. I could be wrong. Kathleen Hanna, the singer from Bikini Kill, who was a friend of Nirvana in the early days. She's the one who said Kurt smells like Teen Spirit, and he took that quote and used it in the song title. So Dave Grohl and then Toby Vale, also the drummer in Bikini Kill. All right. So going on to Kurt's life. Kurt got his guitar as a birthday present. It looks like it was his 14th birthday. So this is Kurt's first guitar. It's interesting, obviously, to think of what he would do with the instrument. 14 is a third house perfection year where he has the natal Mars, South Node, and Neptune. And you can see on his birthday, it happened to be 81 was a year when Mars was also in Pisces alongside the sun. Since it's the Lord of the year, that's kind of a strong, presence. And it's the only time, this is the only solar return in Kurt's entire life where he would have the sun and Mars in Pisces. Think about that for a minute. Yeah. Yeah, because the previous time had been 1964, before he was born, and the next time would be 1996 after he died. So after every single, the only solar return Kurt ever had when Mars, in this case, the Lord of the Year, when Mars was in Pisces with the sun, the only time it ever happened was this 14th birthday of his, which happens to be the day that he got his first guitar. All right. Also very interesting that Uranus was just making its way into Sagittarius at the time. I find that interesting, as well, because when Uranus changes signs, it's like a change in the zeitgeist, if you catch my drift. Um, right, and then there's this okay, so this Black Flag gig, remember I was telling you about, when Jimmy went to see Elvis Presley in 1957, just as Pluto was making its ingress into Virgo. Well, and that was the moment when, Jimmy saw Elvis and like, "Okay, that's what I wanna be," that kind of identification. Similarly, for Kurt, on September 25th, 1984, as Pluto was just making its ingress into Scorpio, Kurt sold all his records so he could buy or some of his records, so he could buy a ticket to go see Black Flag in Seattle, and this was a real life-changing concert for Kurt. He went with his friends Buzz Osborne and Matt Lukin from, the Melvins, and, yeah, they went from I guess he was I forget, he was living either yeah, he was in Aberdeen still, he's still a teenager at this point. What am I thinking? He's like 17, and, yeah, goes to Seattle, where he doesn't live. It's a fair it's over an hour drive away, and goes to see Black Flag, and this totally changes his life, and Black Flag has a really strong impression in terms of, like, if you think of how it impacted Nirvana's sound being sort of part punk, part metal, which is exactly what Black Flag were sort of becoming right at this point in '84. This is when Rollins joined the band. Okay, so then, not long after that, May 11th, '85, Kurt dropped out of school. He was arrested for spraying graffiti on July 23rd, '85. He was arrested again for trespassing and having alcohol, May 18th, '86. Um, he performed when Nirvana were still called, Skid Row. They performed, at Radio Chaos in Olympia. You can see the set list had a lot of songs that we would now associate with Nirvana. They still had this drummer named Aaron Burkhardt. But from there in early '88, they record some demos with Dale Crover of the Melvins playing drums. Some of these tracks are on their first album. They play some gigs. They record the Love Buzz single with their new drummer, Chad Channing. And then towards the end of '88, they record the Bleach album, the rest of the Bleach album with Chad Channing on drums. Um, Sub Pop becomes a big sort of brouhaha in England because of this article in one of the music magazines. Nirvana continued to tour. They have a hard time. I know Kurt. They're in Berlin, like just as the Berlin Wall is coming down, which is kind of interesting. And then Kurt has a total meltdown at this gig a few days later in Rome, Italy. That goes kind of crazy. I think he breaks a guitar or something. Although they often broke instruments, kind of like the Who did. And then finally, it's 1990, and they played Montreal and a bunch of other places. And then their last show with Chad Channing, I think, is this one in 1990. No, actually, he's already left by then. I think this is the last show with Chad Channing. Then they record Sliver with Dan Peters of Mudhoney on drums. That's right. Um, and then they play one gig with Dan Peters, and Dave Grohl is in the audience. This is September 22nd, 1990. Dave Grohl watches them play a gig, and then he joins them right after. And so their first gig with Dave Grohl is October 11th, 1990. Then they go to England. They record their Peel session tracks, which are really great. Some of my favorite recordings of theirs. And they tour a bit. They play Olympia in January of '91. In April of '91, they play a gig at the OK Hotel in Seattle, where they premiere a new song called Smells Like Teen Spirit. And then a few weeks after that, beginning in May of 1991, they start recording the Nevermind album. And they work on that, and then they play some gigs in June, July. Kurt is evicted from his apartment in July of '91, living in his car. And then in mid-August, they play a gig in Hollywood. They shoot the video for Smells Like Teen Spirit on August 17th. A week later, they're at the Reading Festival. For those of you who've maybe seen the movie 1991, The Year Punk Broke, this is the gig that they were here. And then 2 days after that, they're playing this gig in Belgium, and this is where I first saw them. I was in Europe in the summer of 1991, and I was at this Pukul Pop Festival. Really amazing experience. And yeah, Nirvana were a month away from being huge, but they were not famous yet. Um, so yeah, they played there. They played Montreal, and I was gonna go, and I didn't. I'm kicking myself because it was just before Nevermind was released, and they became massive. And then all these gigs are just them becoming the biggest band in the world. They're playing Europe, they're playing England, all over. And then they get to early '92. They're performing on Saturday Night Live. Kurt is really strung out on heroin, and it's around this time that Courtney finds out she's pregnant. So they get married. He has a heroin overdose the day after Saturday Night Live. They shoot the video for "Come as You Are" about a week later. They tour Australia and Japan, and then he marries Courtney in Hawaii. Um, and they do a couple of gigs, but he collapses with abdominal pain. He's having bad health issues. He checks into detox just before his daughter is born. Frances Bean is born in August of '92. They perform at the Reading Festival. Great live album and video of this gig, August 30th of '92. They perform at the MTV Video Awards. Shortly after that, he almost gets into a fist fight with Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses. And then from there, they're working on songs for the next album. They perform these great gigs in Brazil. I've got bootleg videos of these gigs in Brazil, which are some of the best live videos of Nirvana. Kurt's not having a great time, but the anger is so strong that the music's really intense. It's a very, very intense gigs. These three here. I think I have videos for all three of them, or at least two of them. From there, Nirvana in February of '93. They start recording the In Utero album. And at the same time that they're doing that, he's getting into he and Courtney have been under sort of observation, supervision, because they're heroin addicts and their parents, and so that sort of finally ends. They get that off their back. Hole come out with their new single, "Beautiful Sun," which is about Kurt. Comes out during this Venus retrograde in Aries, the red one of 1993. Kurt again has some bad problems. He gets cotton fever from a heroin dose. He gets arrested for domestic assault. But nonetheless, Hole are starting to rise up now, and Nirvana are playing gigs. And then there's this big tour. Nirvana release In Utero. And Nirvana are again on Saturday Night Live, and then they go on a tour. And the next time I see them live is this gig in Montreal on November 2nd. So I was also at this gig. Wish I'd seen the one in 90. Well, I did see them in 91 at the festival in Belgium, but I missed them in Montreal in 91. But at least I saw them in Montreal in 93. And then at the end of this month is when they recorded the MTV Unplugged, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen. And then they played more gigs. MTV Loud and Loud, that's another great live video some of you may have seen. Taped in Seattle, December 13th of '93. Then in the new year, there was this European tour that started great but went poorly. And then the last gig was, I think, this one in Munich. And then Kurt had a drug overdose in Italy. He locked himself in his room with guns on March 18th. He went through his tough love confrontation on March 25th. He bought the gun that he would eventually end his life with on March 30th. He got his friend to buy it. He escaped from rehab on April 1st. And then he was found dead on April 8th. So let's look at his death chart now. Okay, so funny that Kurt died, 24 years after Jimi Hendrix, or 23 and a half years after Jimi Hendrix. But there's Jupiter and Scorpio again. Everyone we've talked about today died when Jupiter was in Scorpio. That's one interesting thing. Let's see. Starting with Jim Morrison, Jupiter retrograde in Scorpio on his midheaven. Janis Joplin, Jupiter in Scorpio. Jimi Hendrix, Jupiter in Scorpio. And Kurt Cobain. Jupiter in Scorpio. So Kurt's in a Sagittarius perfection year. Um, Jupiter rules the seventh and the fourth. And yeah, even though he was a real sort of 12th house kind of guy, there was also, a fourth house dimension to his passing as well. The transits are unbelievable. In fact, I should really show you his secondary progressions because I think his chart with secondary progressions is even more impressive. Um, he was found. He was found, I think, April 8th, but he's believed to have died April 5th. So I'm just using April 5th. But either way, um, whoops, 1998, 1994. Wondering why that didn't look right. Um, so yeah, there's a few things going on here. So transiting Saturn was in Pisces and had been on his sun fairly recently, but his progressed sun had come to natal Saturn. And it's really interesting because if you go back a couple of years when Nevermind was, this big smash hit, it was exactly when his progressed sun was on Venus. So his progressed sun on Venus, and he becomes this huge rock star. And then progressed sun on Saturn, he takes his life. There's a lot to unpack with this. Um, all kinds of interesting stuff. The fact that his Sun and his Mars are in a perfect trine. His progressed Mars stationed retrograde when he's young. How old was he when his progressed Mars stationed retrograde? I used to know all this stuff by heart. 15. So yeah, 1982, about a year after he got that guitar. Okay. Right. Um, let's see here. How are we doing for? Okay, so Lynn asked if I'm covering Amy Winehouse at the time. I do have a file on her. Oh, Kai says, I think we know why Cobain's was looked into, but Hendrix wasn't. Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. Um, I know what you mean. I- You might be right, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It, the thing with Jimmy was Jimmy's manager was not Chess Chandler, but his other manager, Mike something, was a bona fide gangster. Um, and his contract with Jimmy was about to expire. And and this guy himself wound up dying in a plane crash in March of 73, like a year and a half after Jimmy died. Um, but Jimmy's death looks like it looks like he drowned, like someone someone held him down while someone else poured a whole bottle of wine down his throat, and that there was wine in his lungs. The implication was that he drowned, and his manager could very well have killed him just to retain control of his musical dynasty, his recordings and everything that money could be made from. So that's the going theory, and this guy really was capable of it. There's another there's a story of how sometime around September of 69 after Woodstock that Jimmy was kidnapped by gangsters who wanted ransom, and Jimmy's manager was so powerful that he sent literally like higher up gangsters to go get Jimmy and take him away. Like there wasn't even any negotiating. It's like, telling the kidnappers, you don't want to mess with the people that you would have to mess with if you keep Jimi Hendrix kidnapped. So it's really daunting. I I know it's tempting to just think like, okay, Kurt was white, and so people really are more invested in finding out the mystery behind his death than Jimmy. And I know where you're coming from, but I think there's a lot of things behind the circumstances that don't necessarily lead to that specific point. Um, Jimmy's got a very interesting place in that regard. When I was growing up, rock radio was pretty white except for Jimi Hendrix. Like, he was like the one black artist they would play on the rock radio station in Montreal, which is obviously totally bizarre considering, it's a it's a black art form, for starters, and a lot of great black rock artists have made records, but yeah, they'd play your Beatles, your Stones, your Led Zeppelin, and a lot. I mean, music that I like, but they were all white artists. But Jimmy was the only one who was played on that station. He did have a kind of special status. Not that this, makes up for anything, but he did have a really weird place in the business. And it does come up, over the course of his career, like, when he got famous fronting a band with two, white guys, and then he has a period where he does have a band with two black musicians, and that kind of it's a great album, the Band of Gypsies album, but it does, I think the people behind him want him to get back with Noel and Mitch, and it's safer for him to be with the white band or something. And then eventually what he does is he takes one of the black musicians, one of the white musicians, and that's his band for the rest of his life. So yeah, it's something that's always sort of uh it really applies specifically to his life, like the fact that he did go to England to sort of, reinvent himself, and he emerged in the States as this British artist, in a sense, even though he was an American. There's all kinds of very interesting transference going on with his life story, and the impact, the fact that he's there for so short a period of time and records so much music and has such a huge impact on everyone who's of any importance. Um, Bliss to be is asking, do I have any thoughts on Elliott Smith's death? Elliott Smith's death was weird because didn't he like stab himself in the chest? Um, that's a very strange one. It's funny. I played in a band with three guys, and we toured in New York, and we were in New York in 1995, and the singer from my band, we were at this old club called the Knitting Factory, some of you might have heard of, and we were playing the singer from my band was playing pool with some guy, and they were talking about songwriting, and it turned out this was Elliott Smith. This was before he was famous. um I do have Elliott Smith's chart, and let's see here. Yeah, Kai, Jimi Hendrix's manager, his name is Mike. I'll look it up in a minute. Mike something, but he was a serious gangster, and that really it's the most plausible explanation. Whereas with Kurt, I mean, there are some suspicions with Courtney Love and all that stuff, but it isn't nearly as credible as I think as the Jimi Hendrix um, story. So I do have an Elliott Smith file. There's only three charts in it. His death, yeah. Folk punk singer songwriter Elliott Smith has died in apparent suicide. A single knife wound that appeared to be self-inflicted was evident on the body, though police detectives are investigating the incident for foul play and other possibilities. So yeah, that's as much as I know about it. Um, he was not 27. He was 34, which is a ninth house perfection year. No, what am I saying? It's an 11th house perfection year. So he was in a Pisces perfection year when he died. And yeah, October of 2003. This would have followed. He was in a Pisces perfection year. This would have followed the big Mars retrograde in the summer of 2003 in Pisces, a very rare Mars retrograde, the first one in Pisces since 1956. And then this Uranus had only just recently gone back into Aquarius. This Uranus had been in Pisces. So it looks like there was some kind of like Mars Uranus stuff going on for him up there in the 11th. Yeah, I mean, he was, I don't know, he was a really sensitive guy. Um, Okay, so Bliss to be saying Elliott Smith. There was some suspicion because his name was misspelled in his suicide note. His uncle's name was misspelled. Okay, uh, okay. All right. Yeah, I don't know about that. I haven't. I remember when Elliot died, and you can see I made that chart file on Elliot. When he died, which is literally it's going to be 20 years ago this October. All right, I'm going to look at Amy Winehouse, and my voice is giving out, so I'm going to look at Amy quickly, and that'll be it for me today. Here's Amy Winehouse. So not nearly the same size file, 33 charts. But I'll just take you here. Just a few of these. Okay, so this is Amy's chart. Amy Winehouse was a Gemini rising. So when she died, um, she was in a fourth house perfection year here in Virgo, where she has the Sun and Mercury retrograde. She's also a red 5. You can see she was born just as Venus was stationing direct here. But yeah, quite the chart here. And she got in all kinds of trouble. I mean, I've sort of opened it up here. Maybe we don't want to go through everything, but you can see like um, Back to Black, the album that she's really known for, came out in 2006. So I mean, it's kind of funny in the sense that I mean, not funny as in like humorous, funny as in strange. Um, this album, Back to Black, her last album, came out like over almost 5 years before her death. Whereas Jimmy, The Doors, and Janis, and Nirvana, all of them sort of released the bulk of their material starting when they were 24. I guess with Nirvana it was a little bit earlier. Bleach came out, I guess he was 21, but um, The Doors' first album came out when Jim was 23. Janis's first album came out when she was 24. Jimmy's first album came out when he was 24. Um, and Amy here is 23, but she's not going to like all those others. They made records constantly. There's a lot more recordings of them. And, she really just made these 2 albums, the second of which is the really popular one, Back to Black. But you can see she married this troublemaker, Blake Fielder Blake Fielder, in May of 2007. During the Red 5, you remember she's born in a Venus retrograde. So as she's turning 24 during the Venus return, she's rushed to a hospital for an overdose. She appears bruised in public. She's arrested for marijuana in Norway. Her husband is arrested following a police raid. She cancels tour dates. She goes into rehab. No, no, no. She's arrested for assaulting a man in a bar. She's released on bail for a drug video. She apologizes for home video racism. I forget what that was about. I guess she said something racist on a home video or something like that. I'd forgotten. I'd made this file 20 years ago, or not 20 years ago. I made it around the time she died. So, yeah, 13, 14 years ago. She's rushed to hospital. She's taken to hospital. She divorces. She's robbed by burglars. She's charged with assault. And then she plays her last gig in Serbia in June of 2011. She dies on July 23rd, 11. Okay. And this is her death chart. So like I said, she's in a Virgo perfection year. Mercury is the lord of the year, and it appears to be coming. It's just passed over that Venus of hers. I wonder if that Mercury's the Mercury is 10 days from going retrograde. Okay. Yeah. What else is happening to that Mercury of hers? It's a bit more obscure. All I know is that she had a lot of drug troubles, and then she, eventually just didn't leave her apartment one day, is how I understood it happening. It's certainly, I don't see anything really striking in her chart, as far as the death is concerned. It's not as easily traceable as oh, you can't see the charts, damn it. I've gone and done that again. Okay, sorry. I will take you guys through that again. Okay, sorry. Everyone's saying. Sinead O'Connor didn't die at 27. We're just doing the 27s today. Okay, so I'm sorry about. I'm kind of worn out. My voice is worn out. This is Amy's chart on the inside and her death chart on the outside. And I was just saying, I don't necessarily see. I mean, it's interesting. She's having the nodal half return, and that Mars had just crossed the ascendant. Interesting that Mars is square the Lord of the year, since she's in this 4th house perfection year. But yeah, it's not quite as overt as like maybe the other 4 that we looked at, the other death charts we looked at. But what I wanted to say is that, really, when it comes to looking at death in astrology, it's a lot more visible in the charts of the mourners than it is in the chart of the deceased. It's really just impossible to look at someone's chart and figure out when they're going to die. There are legends of astrologers who called it right, and it'd be interesting to know how you could do that on a consistent basis. Okay, I'll show you her file, Kai. I'll show you her file, and then I'm going to go. I'll show you the Amy Winehouse file very quickly. I'm sorry about that. I thought I'd gotten better. Generally speaking, I have gotten better in terms of like rambling on and not realizing I haven't shared the screen. So this is my Amy Winehouse file. There's only 33 charts in it. The release of her 2 CDs, and then various Grammy appearances. And then, yeah, you can see like all those assaults I was talking about, and burglaries and overdoses and being rushed to hospital, all that stuff happening here. And the requisite dates in her timeline. So yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot to share that with you. Okay, my voice is going, and I'm going to need it for consultations later. So I'm going to have to leave it there. But thank you all for hanging in there for that. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. It's yeah, I mean, like everything I do in this live stream, it's a bit of an ad hoc type of presentation, but it's great to reacquaint me with this material. Like I said, I made a lot of these files like over 20 years ago, and I keep realizing like, oh yeah, I used to know like all the details behind this story or that story, and I'm hazy now. And what I ultimately want to do is make a whole series of like proper narrative videos, not just videos of me talking to you guys, but like, videos with visual elements and real productions. And I want to cover these different astrological threads that I've been studying. So I will resurrect a lot of these stories when it comes to making those as well. Anyway, there we go. That's our live stream for the week. Thanks for making it a fun one. Thank you, everyone. I believe Sam is going to be back on this live stream again next Monday, so we can carry on our conversation where we left off last time. I'm having a ball having Sam on the show. I might have other guests, on my Monday live stream down the road. If you guys enjoy that, I don't know. What do you prefer? Having me alone, having guests? Let me know. Next Sunday, I'll be back here with Patrick, and we'll do more of our Patrick and Nick thing. And then next Monday, I'll be here with Sam an hour earlier than usual, 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern on Monday. And then on Sunday, it's 11 Pacific and 2 Eastern. All right. Have a great week, folks. Be terrific. Be excellent to each other. And I will see you next week. Ciao.